This is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub. We believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, author of the novel Love Marriage.
So Sugi, you and I both write about war, and I at least have been trying, we both have been trying to pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine, where tension has been mounting over the prospect of Russia invading that country. There's a growing Russian military presence near Ukraine's border, near the border between Russia and Ukraine. It seems to me like this is going to be a huge test for the Biden administration. And I think of myself as someone who's pretty good at following the news, including overseas. But as I've been reading, I realize that I don't really know as much about Ukraine as I should probably.
I do not either, and also was kind of attempting and failing there. And since you and I are very low-key and relaxed and generally extremely chill about research, I thought we could invite some low-key people to talk to us about Ukraine, its history, and its writers.
You are not okay. I don't know. That's a sarcastic comment. Fine. We've done a lot of research actually on Ukraine since we decided to do this episode, but we do have some excellent people who know a lot more than we do on this. And so later in this episode, we're going to be talking to Marcy Shore, an intellectual historian who teaches at Yale and has written about the connections between Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian politics.
But first, we're excited to talk to my friend Anton Troianovski, the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times, about his reporting on Ukraine.
Yeah, super low key. Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times is the guy we got.
What can I say? Anton arrived in Moscow in January 2018 as bureau chief of the Washington Post. He's traveled to 3 Russian-controlled disputed territories from Crimea to the Kuril Islands to cover the Kremlin's geopolitical gamesmanship. He spent 9 years at the Wall Street Journal, where he covered commercial real estate and telecommunications in New York. And from 2013 to 2017, he was based in Berlin, where he covered 2 German elections, 2 Olympic Games, the Ukraine crisis, migration, and populist politics in Europe. And that was where I last saw you, Anton, in Berlin, around the same time that we started this podcast almost 5 years ago. And it's so exciting to see you again. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you with us.
Great. Thank you for having me, Suki.
Is it more fun to do commercial real estate or what you're doing now?
Commercial real estate was fun, I have to say. It was 2008 when I started the financial crisis.
There was some bad stuff happening there.
Yeah.
Well,
but yeah, this is different.
We're speaking with you. It is Saturday at this time when we're talking. It's Saturday evening, January 22nd in Moscow, where you are. The show comes out next Thursday in the morning. Ukraine, which is one of Europe's largest and most populous countries, has long been contested territory. But we're at a particularly sort of difficult moment there with the military presence from Russia growing near the border. Russia already annexed Crimea in 2014. There's a lot of speculation that they're going to invade Ukraine now. As everyone knows, yesterday, you and Michael Crowley filed a story about the talks that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, had in Geneva about Ukraine. Which led to an agreement for more talks. The headline, which I know you don't write, is U.S. and Russia take a more measured stance in the Ukraine talks. And the piece talks about both sides trying to give diplomacy some time. That seems good. Is there some chance that an invasion can be averted here?
Yeah. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And I would tend to, I think, agree with the assessment that you hear a lot out of Washington these days, that Putin himself hasn't decided what to do. Certainly all these military movements, these troop deployments to Belarus that we're seeing right now look very ominous, but it feels like Russia has certain political goals it wants to achieve in this situation. And it remains to be seen whether or not they can achieve some of them peacefully.
Like what do you think they're trying to get?
The Ukraine is definitely at the core of this crisis. It's not all about Ukraine, but that really feels like the most important factor. So, they've put on the table a very, very far-reaching set of demands. This is kind of like a sort of a Russian approach to diplomacy that we haven't really seen before in this intensity, where they they published these two draft agreements with the US and NATO in December and said, this is what we need. We need it very soon, or else there will be some kind of unspecified, what they called a military technical response. So anyway, those, and those demands essentially would mean a rollback of the NATO presence in Eastern Europe, a legally binding guarantee that Ukraine never enter NATO, that other Eastern European countries that aren't in the alliance right now never enter NATO, that the West withdraw its troops from countries like Poland and the Baltic states that are already in NATO that joined after 1997. Anyway, it's a very, very long list, but it's if you look at it as the start of a negotiation, then perhaps there is some compromise to be had. Certainly that's what Antony Blinken and also Joe Biden have said. They think there is a way to find a diplomatic solution here. Question is there something there that Putin would be willing to accept?
Just a couple of days ago, Biden made that comment about really sort of thinking it would happen. And this article seems to sort of position the rhetoric as getting reined back in. And yet at the same time, I was really struck by the numbers. I think a lot of Americans know that Ukraine vaguely is important, but are probably having a hard time following the kind of entangled history here. But we're putting an enormous amount of money into this. So we've already spent $450 million in aid to Ukraine this fiscal year. And then you noted that it's going to be another $250 million on top of that. What does that pay for? What is that?
Well, that's mainly military assistance that we're talking about. I mean, the West has, since the pro-Western revolution in Ukraine in 2014, the EU and the US and Canada have tried to help Ukraine become a more modern state, essentially. So doing kind of governance projects, anti-corruption projects, but a lot of it is indeed military assistance. It's in recent years that's included Javelin anti-tank missiles. Just yesterday on Friday came the news that the Baltic states would be supplying Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that similar to what the US supplied to the Mujahideen in the Afghan war. So yeah, it's military aid, but it's obviously not anywhere close to what Ukraine would need to actually change the balance on the ground between Ukraine and Russia. Militarily.
I was going to say, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's also only slightly more than the Chiefs are paying their quarterback over the next 10 years. So I can understand why it's not enough to stop the Russian army.
Yeah, I think that's right.
In your story, you write that the U.S. has said it will provide a written response to Russian demands, which include NATO withdrawing troops from territories that you were just talking about, that are formerly aligned with the Soviet Union, like Poland. I don't understand why Russia thinks it gets to make demands in this. Do they have an objectively genuine grievance, or are they just like holding Ukraine hostage and saying, we're just going to shoot Ukraine in the head unless you do these things that we want? That's it,
Right. So, I mean, their answer to that would be if Russia was trying to bring Mexico into a anti-US alliance, the US wouldn't like that either. That's sort of the way that people see that often here in Russia. But of course, you're right. I mean, core to kind of the liberal world order that the US built after the end of the Cold War is that every country gets to decide its own alliances, and that would certainly include Ukraine. I think that this idea that NATO needs to withdraw from, again, as you say, countries like Poland that have already joined NATO, that's kind of one of the most out there seeming elements of these demands. It's certainly almost impossible to imagine NATO agreeing to that. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about how true this is, or whether Putin really even means it. But certainly what Putin says is that he sees a NATO presence in Ukraine as a major threat to Russia that he has to somehow address.
So, okay, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, so, but okay, we've been giving money to Ukraine, but is there actually a NATO presence? Because Ukraine is not a NATO member there, and there haven't really been agreements signed that I know of between NATO and Ukraine, or maybe I've missed something. There was in 2013, they were going to sign that agreement, and then Lukashenko, if I'm remembering the president's name, he refused to do it, right? That was the beginning of the Maidan back
Yanukovych,
in
that's right.
Oh, sorry, Yanukovych.
Well,
sorry, I get those messed up.
Well, that agreement was between Ukraine and the EU.
Okay.
That was what kind of kicked everything off back in 2013, was when Ukraine was going to sign an association agreement with the EU, basically bringing Ukraine closer to the West. Yanukovych, the president at the time, was actually going to sign it, and then essentially Putin convinced him not to sign it, and that led to that explosion of discontent that led to the revolution. So you're right. The NATO presence in Ukraine, in the grand scheme of things, there is no official NATO presence, but there are individual NATO countries that are working with the Ukrainian military, as we already said, sending them lethal defensive weapons, also training. There's a U.S. armed forces are there training the Ukrainian military. The UK has been working with the Ukrainians on their naval capabilities. So it's very small. It's certainly not something you could imagine actually threatening Russia militarily, but that's what Putin is talking about. And sort of, again, what you hear from him is that this is growing and growing and will eventually threaten Russia. But I think the big question to me actually is, why now? Why after all these years is this happening?
I was wondering that. I mean, just sort of what makes this the tipping moment of he's had enough. And I was like, is there something else around here that looks good that I'm missing?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. So like I said, it is the case that Western military engagement with Ukraine has grown, though again, there doesn't seem to be any scenario how Ukraine would actually join NATO in the coming years. But a lot of circumstances have changed. So first of all, Ukraine has a president, Zelensky, who was elected in 2019. You all, I'm sure, know about him.
Who our president tried to bribe and threaten and about this exact issue, basically.
Right, and he's a comedian who had a TV show in which he was playing the Ukrainian president, and so it was then pretty amazing to see a guy who played the president on TV become the actual president. But anyway, Zelensky was someone who, when he came in, was seen as someone who might be willing to do a deal with Putin, because he came in really promising to end the war in eastern Ukraine. And but then over the last year, Zelensky took a much more sort of tougher anti-Russian line. He even put sanctions on Putin's a friend of Putin in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk, who and shut down his TV channels, the pro-Russian TV channels in Ukraine. So that's one thing, is that Ukraine has continued to move closer to the West, and if you look at the polling, that's what a lot of people there want. But also circumstances in Russia have changed. I think Putin feels significantly more secure in terms of domestic politics. He's really managed to eliminate essentially the domestic opposition, the drive. Obviously, Alexei Navalny is in jail. His allies are all in exile at this point. And he sees a West in which he has an opportunity, perhaps, to change the facts on the ground. In terms of Angela Merkel, no longer in power in Germany, President Biden, someone who, when you look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for instance, looks to be someone really trying to reduce America's involvement or in various places in the world. So, yeah, I think Putin is kind of these sorts of tactics are important to understand what he's up to, and I think there's a lot of tactical maneuvering going on here.
I mean, we have you here because you are the fact person. The New York Times takes objective reporting seriously, and we're the people who say the crazy opinioninated stuff, and we can say whatever we want. So you don't have to actually comment on this if you don't want to. But I mean, it just seems to me, you know, the difficulty here is that if this is effective for Putin, if he's like, here are my demands, you must give me written responses to them.
Yeah.
And all I've had to do is like move my troops to the border with Ukraine. He can do this whenever he wants. You know, I mean, what is ever to prevent him from just doing this all day long if he realizes that it gets the results that he wants?
Right, absolutely. And others could be doing it too. China being the most obvious example, was surely watching what's going on here and drawing conclusions from it. And I think you also have to, and that's, as you say, the fact that these are demands. Like if you were engaged, typically when countries are engaged in diplomacy in trying to come to an agreement with another party and make compromises, you wouldn't publish your initial demands publicly, right? Because that takes away your flexibility. Because then if the Russians make any concessions at all, everyone will be able to see that they made a concession because they published all their initial asks. So that's why there is really a concerning theory here that we can't rule out, which is that Putin isn't interested in getting a deal. He's just looking to go through the motions to be able to say to his people and to the world that, well, he tried diplomacy, it didn't work, and so now he has to resort to another option. I think that's one way to interpret this.
I was wondering because, I mean, for the reasons you say, I mean, whether one can understand those demands, to what extent one can understand those demands as genuine, and to what extent there's kind of like an elaborate kind of political performance art going on. I feel like I watch him and I'm always like, I remember you were in the KGB, and I don't know. So it seems like there's sort of like elaborate psychological maneuvering going on.
Yeah, political performance art is a really good way to put it. That is indeed something that has been honed by the authorities here in Moscow over the years. With just looking at how much they've invested into RT, the pro-Kremlin television network. If you look at just the enormous investment that goes into Putin's inaugurations, the annual World War II victory parade, his annual State of the Nation speech, his annual big press conference, his direct line call-in show that he does every year with Russians, it's all stage managed to really, some might say, an exquisite degree. And so, yes, so this looks like it could be part of that.
So I'm curious, speaking of Russia kind of stage managing things, that in some coverage I've been reading about, referendums in heavily Russian areas of Ukraine, indicating support for Russia. And then I also have read a little bit about Ukrainian nationalism and its different forms. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit generally about Ukrainian nationalism and also what it means when kind of Russian aligned forces or Russian politics kind of show up in the Ukraine and indicate, oh, these parts of the Ukraine would like to be in some way independent.
Yeah, it's, Ukraine has such a tangled history, right? It was obviously, much of it was part of the Russian Empire, was part of the Soviet Union, but the western part was also, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. That's just a small tidbit of that tangled history. And and so there have been nationalist movements in Ukraine over the years that are also seen so differently, depending on what part of the country you're in, and depending on your own family history, right? Like there's so many Ukrainians are people who moved there from other parts of the Soviet Union. So anyway, so there's and what I was getting at with that tangled history is that it leads to a situation where people's heroes, the historical figures that they attach to Ukrainian identity vary so much from person to person and from place to place. I remember Zelensky, the new president, his New Year's address from a couple of years ago, when he said we're a country where some of us can honor a statue to Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist leader, and then others can honor a statue to a Soviet general, I believe was how he put it. So it's a very that's a very complex issue. As for support for Russia, so the main referendum that happened in that regard, or what the Russians called a referendum, was the Crimean independence referendum in 2014. I guess you can't see it, but I have a little poster in my office here that I picked up off a lamppost when I was there in Crimea in 2014, covering that. So that was a situation where, indeed, I mean, I could feel it. Most of the people there, or at least a large number of people there, genuinely wanted to join Russia at the time, but they were also totally under the sway of propaganda. Essentially, they were watching Russian TV channels that were portraying the uprising in Kiev as a fascist coup, which it wasn't. And so the kind of this question of pro-Russian attitudes, it's tied up so much with media consumption. It's, you know, it's what TV channels do people watch? What YouTube videos do they watch? What social networks do they use? That's also a really complex issue. And then like one last point.
Well, it doesn't sound completely different than the United States. You know, your opinion on Kyle Rittenhouse depends on whether you watch Fox News or CNN.
Absolutely, and but actually, but I think it's also a kind of a dangerous question viewed from the Russian perspective, because if you listen to Putin, he's convinced that Ukrainians are being torn away from Russia by the West against their will, that they're being brainwashed to be quote unquote anti-Russian and pro-Western, and that, you know, people who speak the Russian language in Ukraine are discriminated against. And I actually this year, or I guess it was last year, I went to one of the most Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, the Kherson region just north of Crimea, where I talked to a lot of people who told me that they considered themselves Russian, or, you know, had deep roots in Russia, and certainly spoke Russian, but at this point had no interest in actually being part of Russia. So I think you really have to separate the identity question in Ukraine from the political question there, and certainly from the language question. There are people who speak Ukrainian in Ukraine who want to be part of the West, and there are people who speak Russian in Ukraine who want to be part of the West. It's certainly much more complex, both than how it's presented here, but also I think how it's often perceived in the West.
So like those are such interesting, like sort of counter narratives of self-determination, like those arguments kind of going in both directions. And it's interesting to think also about Russian identity as separate from the borders of Russia, which I think is not how most Americans are necessarily conceiving of it. Whereas, you know, 30% of Ukrainians, right, speak Russian as a first language. which is a really high number.
Yeah. I mean, it would be, look, if you go to Kiev, it's a Russian-speaking city. Increasingly, people do speak Ukrainian there too, and there are many people who treat that as a sort of political decision that they, they'll speak Russian with their parents who grew up in the Soviet Union, but then with their kids, they speak Ukrainian. But yes, that question of Russian identity versus Russian language versus the borders of the Russian Federation, that gets pretty close to the core of what we're dealing with here, right? Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy because it left tens of millions of native Russian speakers outside the borders of Russia. Obviously, many of those people did not see it as a tragedy or a catastrophe, but Putin's generation, I think there are many people who do.
Right. And we're making lots of references here to Crimea and to the, and I was reading about this, I was realizing, I mean, how deeply embedded this debate is in the culture, because I was reading about the soccer kit, right? The European League soccer kit had the Crimean Peninsula on, like the Ukrainian uniform had the Crimean Peninsula on it. And then these militaristic slogans, and they were allowed to keep the map on the kit because it's the UN recognized Ukrainian border, but they had to take off the militaristic slogan. And I was like, this was not where I expected this argument to be happening. It seems to
really, I mean, the sort of Russian authorities, they, these international organizations are one of the levers of influence that the Russians have here. They're part of, things like the Olympics or the European Soccer Association. They're part of those organizations and they can influence them. And yeah, that's where you see these things collide quite frequently.
It's kind of wild. So you've been covering Ukraine, I think, since 2014, as you referenced. And I wonder, how does this moment feel different to you compared to earlier crises?
Yeah. What's different is the way the stakes have been raised. Back then in 2014, that was certainly also a scary moment because you didn't know what was going to happen. There were, for a few months there in 2014, Russia was sending signals that it was going to try to take over a much bigger chunk of Ukraine than it ended up taking over. But, that was one where Russia was, Crimea, obviously, that annexation happened without a shot being fired, without anyone getting killed. The Donbass war, the war fomented by Russia in eastern Ukraine, the separatist conflict, more than 10,000 people have died in that war since 2014. But that one too, it's one where while Russia was involved in it behind the scenes or undercover, the modern weaponry of the Russian military was not used. Russia was trying to maintain deniability in that conflict. And so what's really worrying right now compared to what was going on in the past is that Russia looks to be prepared to let go of that deniability, to actually openly wage war against Ukraine. And openly waging war against Ukraine means something totally different. It means airstrikes. You think of like the shock and awe campaign at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. That's the kind of thing that military analysts, when they're trying to game out what could happen, are talking about. So this is just a much, even though this crisis has been high stakes now since 2014, things now feel even more serious and even more uncertain.
Now that is very interesting to me because I haven't had somebody use that comparison, that this invasion would look like the shock and now that like an aerial bombardment and all this, that seems Well, that's more than what I even thought would happen. You know, I guess I wasn't really thinking about what the invasion would really look like if it occurred.
Yeah, and again, it's this total speculation here that
Right.
we should
You're
obviously
quoting
be really
military
careful about.
experts who are
But
guessing
yes,
at this.
I am, but still, it's important, I think, to note, because we do have to understand the stakes of what's going on here. If something happens, it could be, really, really bad. It's something much worse than what we've seen so far in Eastern Europe in recent years. And a lot of people's lives would be at risk. But I should also say, though, that I think there is a widespread agreement that Putin, given the questionable amount of domestic support that he would have for a war, we can talk about that separately, but it's not like there's people in Moscow in the streets demanding that he invade Ukraine. Quite the opposite. It would be very scary to Russians as well if that happened. But given that, military analysts also say that he would try to avoid civilian casualties and look to basically destroy the Ukraine's military capability. And not attack cities, for instance. But again, these all would be really awful scenarios, and we're not there. We're not there yet. This kind of thing is not inevitable.
Hey, Sugi, we talked a lot about corruption with Marcy, and we're at
Sure.
time. So can we go to that last question that you have for him, and then we'll sign off?
Sure. All right. 3, 2, 1. So in our exchanges prior to this interview, you mentioned to me that you'd gone to Bulgakov House in Kiev, and we've been talking a little bit about Ukraine's kind of split identity. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your visit there, and also Ukraine's unique position between Russia and the West.
Yeah, this was last April when I was in Ukraine, actually covering the last Russian military buildup around Ukraine, and the last time that people were afraid of an invasion. I had some time to go to the Bulgakov House Museum on the Troianovsky descent in Kiev, where he spent part of his life, and. Yeah, it was a fascinating visit. Bulgakov was a Russian language writer. When I arrived, the tour guide asked if everyone spoke Ukrainian. I said no. She did the tour in Russian, which obviously everyone understood. She quoted from Bulgakov in Russian, and I realized that if she had done that tour in Ukrainian, she would have been speaking in Ukrainian, but then quoting Bulgakov in Russian. I remember it had artifacts and from his apartment in Moscow. It was really hearkening back to a time when there wasn't, a lot of people didn't see much difference between Russia and Ukraine. And I know that in Ukraine, over the years, there's been even controversy around how to treat Bulgakov, again, given that he was from Ukraine, writing in Russian. Yeah, so anyway, so that's just one tiny little example of the sorts of connections that exist between these countries. I mean, everyone here, it seems, has some kind of family connection to Ukraine. I was born in Moscow, but my mom's parents were Jews from Ukraine who moved to Moscow in the middle of the century. And it also, honestly, I think, leads to this sense, as I was saying earlier, that here, not only would people be, I think, scared of a war with Ukraine, but they just can't imagine it because of how many connections there are between these countries. And honestly, if you look at the discourse inside Ukraine right now, there too, people can't really imagine, a lot of people can't imagine Russia actually invading, doing it in a way sort of beyond what has happened already. so yeah, so these connections are totally fascinating. We could we could talk about it for a long time.
Well, Anton, we're glad we got to talk to you about them for this amount of time. And thank you so much for joining us from Moscow in the evening. It's morning here where we are. We really appreciate it. Listeners, to keep following the situation, please follow Anton's reporting in the New York Times.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you guys for having me. Sorry. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks so much, Anton.
Of course.
evening. It's morning here where we are. We really appreciate it. Listeners, to keep following the situation, please follow Anton's reporting in the New York Times.
Thanks so much for
Thank
joining.
you guys for having me. Sorry. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks so much, Anton.
Of course.
All right, we can turn everything off now.
Excellent.
That was great.
That was great.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's interesting that of course there's not a lot of domestic Russian support for it. Doesn't